Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring otherness, more specifically, the problem of otherness. My guest is Cate Montana. She is the author of The E Word, Ego, Enlightenment and Other Essentials, as well as Unearthing Venus, My Quest for the Woman Within. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Cate. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
It's great to be back on the show, Jeffrey. Thank you.
We're going to be talking about otherness today, and specifically, I think the problem of otherness. It's something we all take for granted. I think it's one of the basic distinctions every child learns to make as soon as they develop an ego, which is that there's me and then there's the rest of the world. Although I gather that Freudian psychology postulates that a little child, an infant does not make that distinction. An infant exists in a state of oceanic oneness, almost a mystical state.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely correct. That's where we start out from. And there's no information coming into our brain to tell us otherwise, that I am all that is. And then immediately, as soon as we're born, probably while we're still in the womb, we begin the sensory input through especially our eyes, but ears and skin boundary. And all of this is telling us 24/7, Jeffrey, that I am an individual, that I'm separate, that I'm boundaried. You know, there's me, and then there's you, there's the bush over here. And so very early and pre-verbally, that we move from that oceanic understanding that we are all one and interconnected to this, we are pounded 24/7 with billions of, input of data every second of our lives telling us, I'm over here, you're over there. And I write about this in my book, The E Word, Ego, Enlightenment and Other Essentials, that came out in 2017. This is the foundation. This sensory onslaught is the foundation for the development of the ego sense of I, which is a separate being. And we learn quite early on that the things that are outside of us, that we perceive outside, the cat, the dog, the kitchen stove, mommy spanking us, that, outside stuff can hurt us and be damaging. So we develop this, this boundaried ego that's all about me. It's all about self-protection. And it's all about me and my life and my survival. And it's like, wow, try to get beyond that on the mystical journey of, attaining enlightenment, which, oh God, don't get me started on attaining enlightenment. That's another conversation, impossible as it is. It's like we're constantly struggling with this boundaried sense of self and other.
Certainly, there are different traditions that suggest that this is an illusion. I think in what's known as Advaita Vedanta, or non-dual philosophy, that's the basic point. Everything is one. The only reality is unity. Everything else is an illusion or Maya. I've heard quantum physicists say as much, but it's such a seductive illusion, if it is an illusion, that it's almost impossible to escape from it, except for maybe a handful of mystics or saints or very altruistic people.
Yeah, well, I'm incredibly blessed. I have been a hardcore meditator all of my life, and when I discovered the word enlightenment, I was like, "That's what I want." And I've had the experience, and right there, I'm already off base, telling you a lie. I didn't have an experience. There was no me for 3 days back in 2007, and that was really the hardcore awakening. Was I'd spent 30 years. I want to become enlightened, and then when the personality dropped and the illusion of separation and the illusion of my boundaried separate self occurred, then all I could do was laugh, because it became immediately apparent that enlightenment was the absence of any sense of self whatsoever. So there was no me becoming enlightened. Enlightenment was the absence of me altogether, and that illusory perception. But by God, you're so right, Jeffrey. It's almost impossible to see past the lie that our body senses give us of separation, and it's a gift. And I don't know, it happens sometimes spontaneously for people, because it's the bedrock truth that we really are not separate from one another. But getting there is another is an interesting journey.
Well, and to make matters even more complicated, I know that there are ancient Sanskrit philosophies, Samkhya, for example, which is basically a dualistic philosophy that reinforces the idea of separation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the ego loves the idea of separation, because that's its territory. That's its livelihood, if you will. So, of course, and it's really fascinating to see how assiduous and intelligent the ego is when we create all these doctrines and religious precepts and philosophies, and we go on and on. I mean, God bless Descartes. I think, therefore I am. It's just like, really? I think, therefore I'm totally screwed up and lost is more like it. But you can't convince the ego of that, because the thinking mind is the ego's domain. And the more it can set up boundaries and philosophies and ideas and concepts to get totally lost in its own mind, wow, the more it perpetuates its existence. Tricky son of a gun.
You know, in the human world, I think what this sense of otherness often leads to is a sense of let me see if I can. I'm trying to say two things at once here, so my thoughts are getting jumbled. It can lead to a value system in which one values oneself more than one values the rest of the universe. Whatever is good for oneself is good, and if things harm things that are outside of oneself, well, no problem. It's somewhere else anyway.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at a whole modern Western political system that's set up around that very premise. It's about me and what's good for me, and if it destroys the rest of the world, oh well, la-di-da, I won't be around to see it. It's amazing to me, Jeffrey, the Western European philosophy that really doesn't look at generations down the road like so many of the native cultures. They live to take care for the next generation and for 12 generations to come. How is my life and my decisions and lifestyle going to impact those who are to come? And it's fascinating to me that we have become so selfish. I don't know a better word, and so short-sighted in our selfishness. As long as I'm okay for the next 5 minutes or 5 days or 50 years, that's all that matters. And I think we're reaping the consequences of that right now in our current political situation in the United States. And a lot of the situation that, one of the things I wanted to talk about was we've got so much in the whole Me Too movement and the whole issue about gender and equality that we've been arguing about for 100 years now in the United States. It's like, I think one of the premises of all gender division is this, going back to this perception of self and other, and how from a sheer survival perspective, any sociologist or psychologist is going to tell you that the other, when they are different, appear very threatening to the personal self. And so the immediate reaction is whatever is alien, whether it's a different color skin or a different religious belief system or a different genitalia setup, it's like, get rid of it, move on, get it out of here.
I'd like to talk to you about a concept that I think is associated with otherness. It's called the great chain of being by some people. The idea that there's sort of a spiritual hierarchy with the most enlightened beings, the great saints and Mahatmas and devas and deities at the very top, and then at the very bottom would be the most evil people, or maybe even the less evolved people, insects. You know, if you want to insult somebody, call them a worm, for example. Or some people would even go so far as to say, well, the animal kingdom is greatly evolved over the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom is evolved over the mineral kingdom. But if we accept the premise that all is one, then no part of it would necessarily be more evolved than any other part. And I think you get a lot of our viewers who are going to push back on that, and they'll say, you know, wait a second. Some things are obviously more evolved better than others. If you have a world with no distinctions, what kind of a world is that?
Yeah, well, you know, here we go right straight back to perception again. You know, depending upon your level of consciousness and your perception, I would argue that the worm is a lot more evolved than a lot of individuals on the global stage lately, and that would be insulting the worm. But yeah, hierarchy is an inevitable construct of the ego, and it's an inevitable construct of separation. And you know, and again, a matter of survival. Oh God, if we get into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we go from base level survival as individual boundaried separate humans to wanting home and then family and then love and esteem from others. These are belonging needs that Maslow would argue is the foundation for personal evolution. And then we move into self-esteem needs, where the self becomes all more important. I want to express myself. I want to be seen. I want to be acknowledged. I want to be heard. And that is where the level of enlightenment, or the level of consciousness, if you will, that the whole Western world is really caught up in at this point. And so we've got to bridge beyond, finally, that hierarchical need base perception and become more transpersonal, if you will, more inclusive in our understanding that we are all one. And, you know, by God, that's got to start off as a sheer intellectual exercise, because, again, our senses tell us you and I are one. No way, Jose.
And I'm in Albuquerque and you're in Hawaii.
Yeah, exactly. So we start off with an intellectual understanding, and then by grace and by maybe sheer determination, lots of meditation, a desire for, God, let me know the truth. Let me see what's real. Yeah, that's the only thing I know that can take us to that different perceptual space that is night and day. It's like being awake and like being asleep. It couldn't be better described.
It's interesting that you brought up Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Most college students will study it in their introductory psychology courses, and Maslow originally postulated that first you've got to take care of your survival needs, food, shelter, clothing, then self-esteem needs, and esteem from your colleagues and social acceptance. And then once those needs are met, you can begin to think about self-actualization, or what we might call enlightenment. But I understand that at the end of his life, Maslow reversed all of this. And he basically said the number one need is self-actualization. It has to come before any of the others.
That's interesting. I'd not heard that. I knew that at the very end of his life, that self-actualization, which was for decades the capstone of his philosophy of, I want to be free to be me. I want to be me. Whatever that is, however that expresses, I want to be able to be that to the penultimate. And that self-actualization takes one away from any concern about others' opinions, any sort of externalized judgment. It is a very liberated state, and rightfully so. He elevated it for a very long time. I know that right at the end of his life, that he admitted that there was yet a further stage, and that was beyond self-actualization, and it was that place of, oh wow, beyond the self. That ultimate transpersonal state where the blinders do come off, and we do understand that we are connected at a fundamental energetic consciousness level with all of life. And wow, we're so stuck in hierarchy and better than, and our needs, and this struggle to survive, and I don't know any other way for us to evolve as a species, Jeffrey, until we become a little bit more humble and realize we don't know it all, and to keep that question mark, keep that door open of, wow, well, if I ask who am I and what is really real and what's happening here, if I humbly ask that question, I'm convinced, well, as it says somewhere in the Bible, seek and ye shall find, ask and it shall be opened unto you. I don't know a better doorway, an easier doorway to hold open to, I just want to know. And then give yourself some breathing space every day, whether you meditate or whether you take long walks or whatever, but to keep that doorway of the question mark open so something greater and different can come in and make itself known to you.
One of my mentors is a fellow named Dean Brown, who died over a decade ago, but he was a best friend and a mentor and a great scientist as well. And I had a conversation with him on one occasion because I was convinced that, for example, animals are superior to plants because animals have mobility. Plants do not. And he said to me, no, that's not necessarily true. It doesn't make animals superior. In fact, you could say, he said, that the plants are superior because they get the animals to do their work for them.
Quite often they do. Absolutely. And it's so interesting that as human beings, we cannot help but anthropomorphize and project our own inevitable superiority onto the rest of creation. And since I'm mobile, then of course, a tree is less evolved than something that is mobile. But then of course, then there's people like Stephen Hawking who weren't, mobile at all, who, most brilliant mind on the planet. So yeah, we project all of these attributes of intelligence out there based, unfortunately, on what the mind tells us is intelligence.
In the human realm, one of the basic distinctions everyone makes is between male and female. And you have females complaining, well, it's the men who are running the world and we're not getting paid fairly. And I hear men say, wait a second, women control 3/4 of all the money. What are they complaining about? It's hard. I don't know who's in control here, but I do know that there are groups of people who feel, that males are obviously superior to females. And I've heard just the opposite. In fact, the great anthropologist Ashley Montagu wrote a book on the natural superiority of women. So, in any case, surely males and females tend to see each other as other. There's something different about the other sex, and that creates many, many issues, very serious issues in our culture.
Absolutely. Well, you're basically talking about the battle of the sexes that's been going on for thousands, God knows how many millennia. It's a classic case of otherness, and I think that it's the driving factor behind so much of what we're seeing as far as lack of equality of women in the West. I'll just stick to the United States for now. It's like, since the overturn of the goddess religions 3,000-4,000 years ago, and the rise of the Abrahamic patriarchal religions, which are very masculine, which are very intellectual, very rule-bound, very structured, very right and wrong. These are all masculine attributes. If we're looking at gender at a much more elevated level, it's not about genitalia and how we appear in these physical forms. Gender is actually it's the life force as it is come into creation in either positive or negative form. We're talking about electromagnetic forces of creation itself, which are very different at yin and yang, positive and negative, and so male and female. And we're decidedly different, despite the current modern trend of that's not very politically correct. We're all one, where there's no gender. We've got, 40 different genders, bi, cis, trans, non-whatever. 40 different genders now. And I think it's a really beautiful trend that is subconsciously acknowledging that, yes, we do transcend these mortal forms. We do transcend the limitation of masculine and feminine. We do transcend the limitations of polarity electromagnetically. And yet, here we are. And there are profound differences between the forces of positive and negative, masculine and feminine, yin and yang. And unfortunately, we've come to a place in our current culture where we've come to this struggle of equality, unfortunately, with women and men thinking in terms of equality as, well, we're equal, but only on the masculine ground. It's like I was basically raised to be a guy. Come on, Jeffrey. I was taught to think like a guy. I was raised in a masculine developed educational system, brought into a masculine created economic system and business system in the United States. I was taught masculine based philosophies. I was raised in a masculine based patriarchal Abrahamic masculine church. So I wanted to be equal, but when I wanted to be equal to was a man. I didn't want to be a woman. I didn't want to be whatever that yin, soft, vulnerable, receptive, passive. Oh my God, shoot me now. I didn't want to be passive. All of the Eastern Taoist descriptions of what the feminine yin force was, it just made me want to spit tacks. So it took me until I was like 50 years old to suddenly realize that, oh my God, I'd been raised to be aggressive, intellectual, linear, structured, rule-bound. I'd learned very well the masculine mode of being and expressing the yang. I was very good at that. The yin, I didn't have a clue what the yin was. And there's three ways. If we're going to go back to the conversation to the other, which is what this is all about, and the other is all about maintaining survival of self, and let's say our tribe, and the other, whether they're, again, the skin color is different, their religion is different, they paddle a different shaped canoe, they're other, they're strange, therefore they're a threat, so I've got to get rid of them. That's the basic premise about otherness, is I got to get rid of it. So, there's three ways that we can do that, fundamentally. We can either destroy the other, we can do genocide, which, of course, if men had offed all women, we wouldn't be having this conversation now, unless technologically they advanced very quickly. So that was off the plate. So there was only two ways to control the feminine force of creation. And because, again, the masculine dynamic is all about control and rectitude, righteousness, and structure. Let's keep it all together, people. Let's hold it together. That's kind of the masculine maxim, if you will. The feminine, the wild feminine, the women who run with the wolves, the Bacchantic rites, the Eleusinian rites, we're terrifying to the masculine. The feminine is all about not being in control. It's like, wow, it's the chaos of creation. What can come from a chaos that isn't like craziness, but a chaos that has such a vast level of organization that there's no making sense of it with the linear left brain processes. So what looks like chaos and mayhem of the feminine realm to the masculine is just a different kind of expression and a different kind of intelligence. So, but it's other, so we've got to get rid of it. So if we're not going to kill the women off, if we're not going to commit matricide and sorocide and genocide of the entire human species, then we're left with two options: marginalization or assimilation. So for thousands of years, this is kind of like what's made sense to me is ever since the rise of the patriarchal Abrahamic religions, we have marginalized women. We have made them second-class citizens. We have taken that hierarchical structure and put them down on the bottom and owned them chattel, slaves, concubines, etc. So that spun along up until 100 years ago, and now that doesn't work anymore. We will not be downtrodden. We will overcome. We will rise up. And we have done that. But interestingly enough, now the third way of getting rid of the other is in full bore play right now, and it's assimilation. And that's what I faced and experienced. I had been assimilated into the patriarchal system, the patriarchal mindset, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. So I had the otherness in me had been successfully squashed. And so it's been the last 20 years of my life has been this journey about understanding what the yin force of creation is all about and reframing that. And unfortunately, in our current political situation in the United States, we see so much of, women, again, righteously, and is wonderful, striving and forcing themselves into the masculine mold so that we can stand up and then be counted and be leaders and be president of the United States one day. And it's just unfortunate that we're doing it in a very highly masculine way because it's not accepted to shine any other light. It's very strange.
The introduction to the New Thinking Aloud videos, there's a voice at the start, and it's a man named Jerry Johnson, who is long deceased, but he was a good friend of mine, and in years past, he was a leader in what was known as the men's movement. And he pointed out, for example, that this distinction, this otherness that we have between males and females has resulted in a world where men die on average, I think, about 9-10 years earlier than women do. That what we call masculinity is very harmful to men. And he says it starts when you're like about a 6-year-old child and you're hurt and you start to cry and somebody tells you big boys don't cry, only girls cry. So men are taught never to express their vulnerability. Women are allowed to express their vulnerability. So men develop an armor, a protection, because they can't express their vulnerability. So they have to armor themselves, and that armoring may be, a very serious problem for human civilization overall.
Oh God, totally, Jeffrey. And the problem is that we have made, coming from and again, this is not dissing the masculine or men at all, but coming from a strictly patriarchal masculine mindset of, again, structure and, again, the other feminine, the other vulnerable is seen as hysterical. The other emotional is seen as out of control. The other is, okay, it's okay for a woman to be like that, but that's really not the way we want to be, because that's a lesser way of expressing that. On the hierarchical scale, the feminine is definitely down there with the worm. Okay, and a man doesn't want to go there, and that's been the premise: is that the feminine expression is fine as long as it stays on the feminine side of the fence. And it's judged very harshly, to the degree now that, of course, women coming into a masculine job and coming into the world cannot express any of that more feminine side, that loving, compassionate, emotional side, lest they be seen as less than and then marginalized and dismissed. So poor men, they are so screwed, because the last thing a man in this masculine hierarchical structure of me, man, good, feminine, not so good, but we need her, is, this setup. The poor guys, you're right, they're just locked into this box of what they're, John Wayne 6-shooting, straight talking, beer drinking, never cry, ridiculous image. And the truth of the matter is, if we look at the Taoist symbol of the yin yang symbol, there's a point of black in the white element, and there's a point of white in the black element. We are not black and white beings. We are whole. The most masculine of men has the capacity and the feminine elements in him of expression and emotion and compassion and inclusivity, and has a right. Guys have right brains, just like women have left brains. The point that we're trying to get to is to become whole brain beings, where we can acknowledge, recognize, understand, and admit and include these other aspects, where the beautiful thing about the women's revolution and the women's movement has been that we have learned how to be guys. We have learned stalwartness. We've learned left brain function. We've learned the power of logic. We've learned how to control our emotions. We've learned how to build organizations and structure, on and on and on. We've learned to be aggressive. Put a AK-47 in my hands, I can take out the next guy just as good as the guy sitting next to me. Women have really evolved, because now we've got the masculine yang side to us. Now we're just in danger of losing sight of what the yin actually is. And I think this is, the Dalai Lama about 10 years ago talked about Western woman being the salvation of humanity. Well, that's because women can show the men finally that it's okay to be inclusive, that it's okay to open up to the feminine side in their own being. But we can only do that. We can only lead men to their wholeness by ourselves being whole as women. So we've got to regain, recapture, recommit to this other part of ourselves, so that we as women can be whole and turn around to our beautiful, beautiful brothers and go, don't worry, dude, this is a good space. You can open up, you can cry, please, let me in, let yourself in, let the rest of yourself in, so that you can put down the armor and you can rest finally in the wholeness and the completeness and the safety of who you really are.
I'm sure you appreciate that there's a backlash against this movement as well. I occasionally hear from women who bemoan the fact that men are becoming more feminized and softer, and they feel, we need the warrior types.
Yeah, well, we do. We need to be it all. And the problem is ignorance, Jeffrey. That's always the problem, no matter what you're talking about. Ignorance is not bliss. and so dynamically in our culture, we are not having a whole conversation about gender dynamics. We are not bringing to the table, there are these enormous swing movements. The Me Too movements is screw the guys, down with men are bad, horrible, blah, blah. And then we've got the, I bemoan that I have to wear the pants in the family and my husband is too soft. Oh my God. And then we've got the no gender movement whatsoever, where we want to make everybody just exactly the same. And it's like, so we've got all of these factions and these opinions showing up on the world stage, anything but a cohesive, coherent, inclusive conversation that takes a breath and that stops trying to take a position of I'm right and this is how it is. This is like, well, let's step back, people, and go, maybe there's more to being a man than we are admitting. Maybe there's more to being a woman than we're seeing and acknowledging. And maybe we can put down the stupid battle of the sexes long enough to investigate ourselves and who we really are at our core and our largesse and our beauty, and begin to explore our potential rather than always going to fisticuffs,
I am under the impression that a lot of our sense of otherness is caused by the limitations of our own bodies and nervous system. Our sensory organs only take in a very, very tiny amount of the reality that's out there. A tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum gets seen as light. A small amount of mechanical vibrations get heard as sound. We don't see or hear everything. We certainly don't smell everything. Dogs can smell a million times more than a human can, I understand. And so we form pictures of what the outer world is like in our mind that are really, although we think of them as not even pictures, we don't see that. What we see is just a map of reality. We think we see reality itself. And so inevitably, whatever we picture the world to be is going to be incomplete at best and more likely greatly distorted.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, Jeffrey. And that's that's the beauty of quantum physics and the consciousness studies and the horizons that we're seeing in biochemistry and medicine. We are coming into an energy healing quantum state of understanding in our science that acknowledges that, wow, this skin boundary is an illusion, pure and simple. And so science, God bless science, is taking us by the hand quite rapidly to move us into a state of greater reality, of seeing the whole picture and understanding. Again, we start intellectually because we're battling 24/7 this inevitable construct of I'm separate and and boundary that my senses give me. But science is taking us to where the mystics have been for the last 30,000 years. Unfortunately, it's not yet reached popular philosophy. It's not, if the average man and woman on the street understood a little bit about the fundamentals of quantum physics and what quantum physics is actually telling us about reality, it might make us take pause and go, huh? and throw a question mark in the business. That's the thing about the ego. The ego does not like question marks. Actually, the masculine side of the intellect doesn't like question marks either. I like the answers. I like firm boundaries. I want to know that the right beer that I drink is going to be in the refrigerator when I get home at 5:30, and that this show is going to be on, and that Tuesday night means roast chicken, and I don't have to think. The ego is supremely comfortable in the known and in that position, in that picture of what we have come to see as reality. No matter how painful the bloody picture is, that's the thing. We will accept war. We will accept the inevitability of the battle of the sexes. We will accept the inevitability of conflict and otherness and having to be superior and to constantly strive and struggle. That's the ego. That's the ego identity. What we have been trained to believe about ourselves. It's most comfortable to continue on in that portal of perception, if you will. So I think unfortunately the key is that things have got to get so uncomfortable. Pain is a great teacher, and until we learn to grow and expand and evolve from a perspective of curiosity and excitement and desire to know more and a willingness to let these boundaries thin out a bit in our own mind, then we're up against the wall. The only thing that's going to change us is pain and suffering to make us go, wow, God, again? We've gone here again? Maybe there's a different way.
If you look at Western history, we've been through in the last 100 years a lot of suffering. There have been 2 world wars. There's been enormous famines and dislocations. I have no reason to think that the next 100 years aren't going to have major problems. We're already looking at the possibility of climate change and we're living through one of the great mass extinctions in the history of the planet right now, mostly caused by human activity. So there's every reason to think that this momentum that the human civilization is on, and I think Eastern and Western basically, is going to continue for a long time. So I foresee that these changes that we're talking about, Cate, are so deep, so profound that they're likely to take hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Well, number one, I will say, I don't know. but I suspect, because time is seemingly moving exponentially and growth is happening. I mean, what's happened to you and me in the last 50 years would have been unimaginable 50 years before that to that population. Yeah. And it's only snowballing. So I have a feeling that it's not going to take thousands of years. I have a feeling we're going to really hit the fan in the next 100 years and going to have to start facing up to what we've created and the mindset that has created the problems that we're going to be facing. And that, and then we'll see what happens from there. And I don't think it's going to be pretty. But I also believe fully that those who have moved into a more gracious, expansive, inclusive, softer, more loving state of mind, that's what the world needs, is those people who have come to a greater common sense, if you will, and will be able to stand in a larger truth and shine that light during times of trouble, which are inevitable from, kids make a mess. Kids make a mess, and we have been kids, with nuclear bombs and tanks and social media. So I think it's going to be tough, but I think that we've got so many people now are waking up, Jeffrey. I mean, a show like this wouldn't have been in existence, wouldn't even have been conceived of 50 years ago. And the topics that you talk about, it's phenomenal. So I think there's great hope.
Cate Montana, I appreciate your optimism, especially in the face of my pessimism.
Balance on all things, Jeffrey.
Yeah. And balance does seem to be an important thing. As a parapsychologist, I'm kind of inclined to think that when people can balance the masculine and feminine within themselves, the conscious and the unconscious within themselves, that's when awakening occurs. That's when psychic development occurs.
Absolutely. And what we're seeing in the whole Trump era now and in the vast divisiveness in our nation, the upside is we are being forced to look at our shadow side. Everything that was shoved aside in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, the Leave It to Beaver generation, where everything is just nice, everything is fine. Nothing's fine. And we realize that now. We're having it shoved in our faces, and it is horribly painful, unpleasant, and absolutely necessary. And I think one of the most amazing gifts that is rolling through this planet at this point in time is we are being forced to look at our shadow material and to embrace it and see it as part of us and become more inclusive and move on from that, rather than continuing to stuff it away. Wow.
You're reminding me of a line from a poem by Christopher Fry, called The Sleep of Prisoners, where he says, "Thank God our time is now when evil confronts us on every side."
Exactly. Exactly, because these are the times that make us stand up for what we know inside of ourselves and hopefully, fingers crossed, humble us enough so that we are flexible in what we know and flexible enough to go, I don't know it all, but let me embrace this possibility. I've never really looked at this. I never looked at my own, judgment of men before. I never looked at my own judgment of women before. It's like, wow. So hopefully a certain level of humbleness will come with this whole process, because that's what it takes.
Well, Cate Montana, what a delightful conversation. I'm so glad we've reconnected. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been a great pleasure, as always.